They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving, not even a text. But 2 days later, they sent me an invoice for $31,000. That's right, my own son. The house I bought, the one he's been living in for years without paying a dime, suddenly came with a bill, and he expected me to smile, nod, and foot the cost. At 74, I thought I had seen it all, but nothing prepared me for that moment. What I did next didn't involve yelling. No threats, no revenge. I simply reminded them who owned the deed, and who still had a spine. I folded the cloth napkin one more time, smoothing out the corners until it looked almost perfect. The turkey was just enough for one dry from the oven, but still warm. Mashed potatoes, cranberry jelly straight from the can, and a single slice of pumpkin pie I had picked up from the gas station on the way home. It wasn't much, but it was something. Across the canal, the row house was lit up like a ship. Their backyard glowed with lanterns strung along the fence. I could hear laughter echoing across the water, sharp and light. My grandson was probably running around in that little dinosaur costume he loved so much. There was music, glasses clinking, the sounds of a family gathered. Except I wasn't part of it. I hadn't gotten a call, not a message, not even one of those lazy group texts people send when they want to look like they've made an effort. I glanced at my phone again, screen bright, empty. The date blinked at me. November 23rd, Thanksgiving. Last year, I was the one basting the turkey in that very house. Before that, I hosted it in the community center down by the marina, back when I was still volunteering weekends. Before arthritis made even the coffee pot feel like a brick. But this year, I wasn't even on the list. I took a bite of turkey and chewed slow. It tasted like memory. That's the strange thing about getting older. People stop looking at you like someone with stories and start seeing someone in the way. I used to run things at the marina, at the house, at PTA meetings and budget committees. Now I was a name on the tax record and a photo in a drawer they probably never opened. I didn't cry. Not really. I just sat there and let the quiet fill in the parts where family used to be. Out the window, Travis stepped onto the porch with a beer in hand. He was talking to someone I couldn't see, laughing, that confident kind of laugh he used when he thought no one was watching. I remember when he used to reach for my hand before crossing the street, when he used to fall asleep in my arms with peanut butter still on his chin. Now he forgot I existed. Well, not entirely, but that part comes later. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the lights across the canal dimmed, I rinsed off my plate and wrapped the leftovers. I stood at the sink, watching the condensation on the window drip like slow tears. I thought about calling him, just to say hello, just to ask if maybe they had meant to invite me, but forgot. But I didn't. Something deep in my bones told me that call wouldn't change a thing. So I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the dark, letting silence hold me like it was the only family I had left. If you've ever sat alone at a family table that once had your name on it, you know the silence can be the loudest thing of all. Stay with me. Because this story isn't about bitterness. It's about what happens when a mother stops asking to be remembered and starts remembering herself. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I woke up early. I had slept better than expected, mostly from exhaustion, not peace. The sun was slow to rise, casting a pale orange across the blinds. I made coffee, the cheap kind, but it was warm and dependable. Just as I took my first sip, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was an email. The subject line read, "Re-house maintenance costs." For a second, I didn't move. My stomach tightened the way it used to before getting called into parent-teacher conferences or late-night ER visits. I tapped it open. It was from Travis. Just his name showing up in my inbox made something shift inside me. It had been months since he reached out directly. And when he did, it usually meant something was wrong for him, that is. I started reading. Hi, Mum. I hope you're doing okay. We meant to touch base earlier, but with the holiday rush, it got away from us. I wanted to share a summary of the recent maintenance costs for the house, which are tied to your name, as you're still the legal owner. Attached is the breakdown for your share, totaling £31,074. Please review and let us know how you'd like to handle it. I read it again. And then a third time. No invitation to dinner. No checking how I spent Thanksgiving. No photo of the kids. No apology for leaving me alone. Just a spreadsheet with numbers and a polite corporate tone, like I was a landlord he barely knew. Attached was a PDF. I opened it. Paintwork, plumbing backyard deck, repairs new appliances. Some of it was legitimate. Some of it I had no knowledge of. There was a full replacement of the master bathroom vanity. New tile work. Upgraded fixtures. A wine fridge. It was the kind of renovation people do when they're preparing for a magazine shoot, not maintaining an aging property. And somehow they expected me to cover nearly half of it. I scrolled down to the bottom line. He rounded it to exactly 31,000. Just like that. No context, no warning, just a bill. It wasn't a request. It was a notice. He didn't ask if I could help. He expected I would, because I always did. That was the thing with Travis. Ever since he was a boy, he learned I would show up, whether it was a scraped knee or a broken lease. I'd cover for him, quietly, gratefully, because I was his mother, because that's what mothers do. But this wasn't a scraped knee. This was theft, dressed in manners. I closed the email and placed the phone face down. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like something important had slipped out without me noticing. I thought back to when we first bought that house. After his job at the bank fell through, I offered to help them settle somewhere safe. I put my name on the deed, not to control him, but to protect what was left of our family's security. I never charged rent, never asked for repayment. I even helped with the down payment with the promise that it was still mine, technically. He agreed, said it made sense. Back then, I believed him. Now it was clear he believed something else. That I was too old to remember, too soft to push back, that I'd quietly open a checkbook out of guilt or habit. But I wasn't old enough to forget betrayal. And I wasn't soft enough to pretend I didn't notice. That evening, I didn't reply to his email. Instead, I printed the invoice and pinned it to the corkboard above my writing desk. I stared at the total bolded in black ink and realized something for the first time in years. This wasn't just about money. This was about erasure. He hadn't invited me to Thanksgiving because I no longer served a purpose, because I was no longer a source of joy or usefulness. I was just a name on a deed, a liability to be handled quietly. That's when the quiet inside me started to change shape, not into anger, but into decision. And that decision didn't involve $31,000. It involved remembering exactly who I was. The house Travis lived in wasn't just a building. It was part of me. I could still remember how it looked the first time we walked through it together. The walls were a dull beige, the carpets worn down, but he had stars in his eyes. Lydia had taken my arm and said they could make it a home, but it would take some work. Back then, he had just lost his job at the bank. The market had turned, and like so many others, he was cut loose. Lydia was managing a small hair salon on the other side of town, bringing in just enough to cover groceries and gas. They had a toddler and another baby on the way. I had just retired from my position as operations manager at the marina. I wasn't rich, but I had enough set aside. Enough to help. Enough to believe that this was the right thing to do. I told them I'd handle the down payment. I offered to put the deed in my name just to keep things safe. Travis had some unpaid taxes that could complicate financing, and frankly, I knew his track record. I never said it out loud, but I always knew he wasn't the best with money. He agreed, quickly, maybe too quickly, but I took it as gratitude. The arrangement was clear. They could live there. I wouldn't charge them rent. In return, they'd take care of the place, maintain it, build their life in it. Someday I'd transfer it to them officially, when things settled, when I felt it was time. That was nearly a decade ago. In the early years, things felt right. I'd visit once a week, sometimes twice. I helped them paint the nursery when the second baby arrived. I brought groceries, watched the kids, took Lydia to her appointments when Travis couldn't get away. It wasn't always easy, but it felt meaningful. Then, little by little, the door started to close. They stopped asking me over. They started cancelling dinner plans last minute. Birthdays were celebrated without me. Travis said they were busy. The kids had school. Lydia's schedule was packed. And somehow I always understood. I didn't want to intrude, so I stepped back. But I still paid the property taxes every year, quietly, without asking, just to make sure things stayed clean. I never thought to ask what they were doing with the place. I never imagined they'd renovate it into something else entirely, until that invoice showed up. I sat at my desk that night with the printed bill in front of me and pulled out the folder marked House Row. It was thick. Receipts, tax records, maintenance notes. At the very back, the deed. My name, no one else's. I ran my fingers across the embossed stamp the way someone might trace a name carved on stone. It hit me then, hard. They hadn't just taken over a house. They'd erased the memory of how it became theirs in the first place. Not once had Travis mentioned the help I gave. Not once did Lydia say thank you in the years since. They lived there as if it were rightfully theirs, built from their sweat and money. But it wasn't. It was me. All of it. The floors they walked on, the walls they painted, the garden they reshaped. All of it existed because I stepped in when they had nothing. And now they were handing me a bill, as if I had been freeloading. I leaned back and let that thought settle. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. There was no need for anger, just clarity. Travis had never wanted a mother. He wanted a cushion. And now that he thought he no longer needed one, he believed I was disposable. He was wrong. That night I didn't sleep much, not out of sadness, but out of sharp, focused thought. I walked through the timeline of the past 10 years, what I gave, what I lost, what they took for granted, and I thought about what came next. Because I still had that deed. I still had a voice. And for the first time in a long time, I intended to use both. I hadn't planned to go near that house again. But sometimes the heart disobeys what the mind decides. 3 days after that invoice arrived, I drove across town. I told myself I just wanted to see the place, just to remind myself it was real, that I hadn't imagined giving them that home, that I hadn't imagined all those years of birthdays, barbecues, and late-night calls from Travis when he didn't know how to unclog a sink. It was early afternoon. The sky was dull and grey, the kind of winter light that made everything look colder than it really was. I parked across the street in the shade of the big elm tree that still hadn't been trimmed. I used to nag Travis about that tree every fall. He always said he'd get to it. He never did. The driveway was empty except for Lydia's silver SUV. A wreath hung on the front door. Holiday lights curled along the porch railings. It all looked festive, normal, inviting. But I knew better now. I stepped out and crossed the street slowly. I wasn't planning to knock. I just wanted a closer look. Maybe a few minutes standing in front of what used to be mine. As I reached the sidewalk, I heard voices. Not yelling, not laughter. Just two people talking quiet, but not quiet enough. The side window was cracked open. Travis and Lydia were in the kitchen. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. Travis said my name. He was frustrated, tired maybe, but not remorseful. She's getting older. I don't think she understands how much this house costs to maintain, he said. Then Lydia's voice. I mean, it's in her name, technically, but we've lived here almost 10 years. We've built a life here. It's basically ours now. Exactly, Travis said. And she's not using it. She doesn't even visit anymore. If she really cared about us, she'd sign it over. There was a pause. Then Lydia added, honestly, she should be grateful we even kept her on the documents. It's not like she's paying utilities or anything. They both laughed, lightly, casually, as if I were a topic at a dinner party, as if I were a burden they were patiently managing. I stepped back from the window. My feet felt heavy in my shoes. There was something about hearing the words out loud. Reading that invoice had stung, but hearing my own child speak of me like that, like I was in the way, like I owed them, there was no dressing that pain. It wasn't just the ingratitude. It was the assumption that I would just give in, that I would quietly disappear, hand them the deed, vanish like smoke. I walked back to the car without looking again. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. My hands were calm on the steering wheel. But inside something closed. It wasn't spite. It wasn't bitterness. It was recognition. Travis didn't see me as his mother anymore. He saw me as a transaction waiting to be completed, a deed to be signed, a problem to be solved. I drove out of that neighborhood for the last time that day. Back at my condo, I opened the cabinet where I kept all the important documents, deeds, tax returns, legal papers. I took out the folder again, the one marked House, Row. I read through it line by line. I made notes. I called a friend of mine from the marina, Carol, whose daughter was a real estate attorney. I didn't explain everything. I just asked for a referral. Carol didn't press. She just gave me the number. That night, I boiled pasta and ate at the kitchen counter. I left the radio on an old jazz station from Clearwater and listened to the saxophone hum through the speakers. I didn't think about what Travis had said. I thought about what I was going to do, because now it was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about remembering I still had choices, and I was about to use them. The next morning, I packed a small overnight bag, a few sweaters, a pair of shoes, my reading glasses, a scarf my sister had given me 15 years ago. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. There was no one to tell. I drove south along the coast, past the town where I used to work, past the grocery store where everyone used to know my name. The marina sat just beyond the bend, quiet in the winter light. Boats bobbed in the slip, rocking gently like they were breathing. That dock had been my second home for nearly 30 years. I parked near the edge and walked out to the end of the pier. The air smelled like salt and old rope. The breeze carried that faint hum only the sea could bring. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt my heartbeat settle. It had been years since I stood on this pier. I stopped visiting after I retired. The old crew moved on. Some passed away. Some moved north. The young ones didn't remember who I was, and I didn't blame them. But the sea remembered. And in that moment, I remembered too. I wasn't just someone's mother. I wasn't just a name on a deed. I was a woman who had built a career from nothing, who had overseen daily operations through storms, thefts, budget cuts, and tourist surges. I was the one they called when the harbour lights failed, or when a shipment was held up in customs. I wasn't always loud, but I was always solid. I walked back toward the small cafe that overlooked the water. It used to be just a shack, but someone had turned it into a polished little breakfast spot. I took a table by the window and ordered coffee and toast. The young waitress called me Ma'am, with a kindness that felt genuine. I opened my notebook and began writing. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a journal. It was a list. A private one. What I own. What I gave. What I sacrificed. What I need. What I will no longer accept. By the third line, my hand had steadied. By the fifth, I felt something return. Not confidence exactly. Something quieter. Stronger. I spent the night at a small inn by the shore. The bed was stiff and the walls thin, but I slept well. The next morning I made one more stop before heading home. There was a lawyer's office above a fishing gear shop just off the main street. A clean brass plaque read Ashby and Lane Property and Estate Law. I hadn't made an appointment. I didn't need one. Inside, the receptionist offered me tea. I gave her my name and told her I needed to speak to someone about a property matter. I waited 20 minutes before a man in his early 40s stepped into the lobby. "Ms. Rowe," he said, "I'm Stephen Ashby. Please come in." His office smelled like leather and lemon oil. Neat stacks of folders lined the bookshelf. He asked me how he could help. I told him the basics, that I owned a house occupied by my son and his wife, that it was under my name, that I had just received an invoice, that there had been tension. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he didn't offer advice right away. He leaned back thoughtful. "Do you want to remove them?" he asked finally. I nodded. "Then you can," he said, "and we'll do it legally, respectfully, and in full compliance with Florida property law. But I'll need documentation. Copies of the deed, proof that you paid taxes, and we'll need to serve formal notice." I told him I had everything. I had kept every receipt, every letter, every official paper for 10 years. He smiled. "Then we'll begin next week." I stood to leave. He offered a handshake. It was firm, but kind. Back in my car, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I felt ready. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't about punishing Travis. This was about reclaiming space. I had let them live in my home rent-free for a decade. I had allowed them to take comfort while I shrank in silence. I had trusted they would remember who gave them their start. They hadn't. So now I would remember for them, and I would do it properly, quietly, but unmistakably. 2 weeks passed between my visit to the attorney and the day I signed the documents. During that time, I went about my routine almost exactly as before. I watered the potted plants by the window. I took short walks around the block. I fed the cat next door when the neighbors were out. On the outside, I was the same. But something inside had shifted. The silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like preparation. Stephen Ashby worked efficiently. We spoke only twice after our first meeting. He requested additional paperwork, which I had already prepared. Every page was organized, dated, and clipped. He was impressed by my record keeping. I didn't explain that being overlooked for years had trained me to keep track of everything. On the 14th day, I signed the order for formal notice. We weren't evicting them yet. That would be premature. But we were starting the process of reasserting ownership. It began with a letter. Polite, neutral, legal. It stated that I, as the sole legal title holder of the property, was undergoing a review of the occupancy agreement. It reminded them that there had never been a formal lease, that their stay had been based on family arrangement, not a contract. It requested a meeting to discuss next steps regarding future tenancy. In short, it made it clear the silence was over. Stephen sent the letter via certified mail return receipt requested. I received confirmation 2 days later. Lydia had signed for it. I waited. 3 days. No email, no call, no knock on the door. On the 4th day, a reply arrived. It wasn't from Travis. It came from a local attorney I didn't know. A short letter unsigned by Travis himself, referencing ongoing occupancy and potential ownership implications. Stephen reviewed it calmly. "They're getting nervous," he said. We drafted our response. Cordial, direct. We reiterated the facts. We reminded them of the absence of any financial contribution on record. No rent, no shared property tax, no documented agreement of transfer. And we enclosed a preliminary notice to vacate 90 days. Not a threat. A step. I signed my name at the bottom, slow and deliberate. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. My hand was steady. That evening I lit a candle on the kitchen table. Not for prayer, not for drama, just for stillness. I sat in its glow, sipped my tea, and realized this was the first time in years I had made a decision that was solely mine. Not for peacekeeping, not for forgiveness, not for family. For me. Somewhere across town, I imagined Travis reading the letter. I pictured Lydia pacing their remodeled kitchen, the one they built on assumptions. I wondered what they would say, but I didn't dwell, because this wasn't about their reaction anymore. It was about reclaiming the right to respond. On my terms, in my voice, through legal channels that couldn't be talked over at family dinners. They had wanted silence. Now they had clarity, and clarity was far more powerful. The first sign that they felt the shift was when Lydia showed up at my door. It was early afternoon, the sun filtering through the blinds in strips of soft gold. I was sitting at the table with a half-finished crossword and a warm cup of mint tea when the knock came. Soft at first, then firmer. I opened the door and found her standing there, her hands tucked into the pockets of a thick beige coat. She looked surprised that I answered so quickly, as if she had hoped I wouldn't. We stared at each other for a long second. She didn't ask to come in, and I didn't offer. She glanced at the floor, then straightened her spine and fixed her eyes on me with a blend of guilt and defiance. "We got your letter," she said. I nodded once. "We didn't expect this from you," she added. It felt cold. I didn't respond, not with words, just that still silence that had become my language lately. She shifted her weight. "I mean, it's just, after everything, we didn't think you'd go that route. With lawyers." Still, I said nothing. Because what was there to say to someone who had spent years believing I was too weak to act, too sentimental to defend myself? Lydia finally broke the silence with a thin smile, one that didn't touch her eyes. "Travis is upset," she said. "He feels like you blindsided him." I thought about the decade of unpaid gratitude. The birthdays missed, the dinners unreturned, the holidays unacknowledged, the $31,000 invoice sent without warning. If Travis felt blindsided, it was only because he had never considered I had boundaries to cross. He thought we were family, Lydia added. At that, something inside me stirred. Not rage, not sorrow, just a deep, still ache, because I had once thought that too. Finally, I spoke. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "It's about respect and restoring what was lost." Lydia didn't argue. She looked away, then back again. "We'll talk to our lawyer," she said quickly, and turned before I could say anything more. I closed the door quietly behind her and returned to my tea. From that moment, the tone changed. The lawyer letters came slower, more careful, less aggressive. Stephen Ashby called a few days later to say Travis's attorney had requested a mediated meeting. I agreed with the condition that it take place at Stephen's office and that all communication go through him. I wasn't looking to negotiate. I wanted acknowledgement. When the day of the meeting came, I wore my navy coat and a simple silver pin my mother once gave me. I didn't dress to impress. I dressed to remember who I was before I let guilt shape my decisions. Travis arrived 5 minutes late. His tie was loose, his expression tight. We sat on opposite ends of a long oak table. His lawyer began by trying to soften the edges. He mentioned family. He used words like transition and misunderstanding. I listened, quietly. Then Stephen laid out our terms. There would be no eviction yet. I wasn't interested in forcing them onto the street. But the deed remained mine. The house would be sold within 6 months. The proceeds would not go to Travis. They had made no investment, paid no tax, contributed no equity. Their occupancy had been conditional, and it was over. Travis shifted uncomfortably, then said something that surprised even me. "We thought you were done with all that. Real estate money. You've been alone for years. We assumed you didn't care." That word. Assumed. I didn't respond with anger. I let the pause stretch. Then I said I may be alone, but that doesn't mean I'm invisible. It landed. He looked down, and I saw something flicker in his face. Not regret, but maybe recognition. The meeting ended without a handshake. I walked out into the cold air, the sky grey, but open. My breath came easy. There was no elation, but there was relief. For years I had let the silence swallow me. Now I had spoken without shouting, and they had heard me. The sale of the house didn't happen quickly. Real estate never moves as fast as emotion. But once the agreement had been signed, the path became clear. A closing date was scheduled 6 months out, and from that moment everything shifted into a quieter gear. Travis and Lydia didn't contact me again, not directly. All updates went through their attorney, and Stephen kept me informed. There were no dramatics, no pleading, just two people coming to terms with the fact that something they had counted on no longer belonged to them. In those weeks, I returned to a rhythm that felt more mine than anything had in years. I spent mornings walking to the bakery 2 blocks over, where the young man at the counter always asked if I wanted extra cinnamon on the latte foam. I started replanting my balcony garden. I subscribed to a small literary magazine out of Maine, one that printed essays from women over 60. It felt like I was collecting pieces of myself that had been quietly scattered for too long. One morning, while rearranging a shelf in the hallway closet, I found an old cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. It was labelled with my handwriting. In pen, just one word, Travis. I carried it to the table and opened the flaps. Inside were photo albums, school programs, little drawings made with crayons. A rock painted like a turtle. A Mother's Day card from 2nd grade that still smelled faintly of glue. There were letters, too. Notes he had written from camp, scribbles on the back of grocery lists. One folded page with the words, "Don't be sad," written in uneven pencil drawn after his father left. I took my time with that box. Every item was a memory, but not all of them were painful. Some were warm. Some still made me smile. Others reminded me of the years when love was uncomplicated, when being his mother was a role that came without strategy, without second-guessing, without disappointment. I didn't cry. What I felt was gentler than grief and heavier than nostalgia. It was like holding proof that I had tried, that I had shown up, that I hadn't imagined those years when he needed me. And somewhere in the middle of that, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer needed him to admit he had taken me for granted, because I no longer doubted what I had given. That afternoon, I packed most of the items back into the box. I kept a few. A photo of us at a beach in Sarasota, where his hair was tangled from the wind, and my arm was slung over his shoulder, like I could still protect him from everything. That picture went into a small frame on my nightstand, not as a monument to sadness, but as a record, a witness. a chapter I had written with both hands and a full heart. In the following weeks, I met with Stephen twice more. We finalized timelines, handled disclosures, prepared for closing. I signed each form with the kind of steadiness that only comes after making peace with your choices. The final check from the house sale was scheduled to arrive via certified mail, and when it did, I didn't open it right away. I left it on the kitchen counter for most of the afternoon, not out of fear, but because I wanted to receive it with presence. It wasn't just money, it was the physical symbol of a boundary restored. When I finally slit the envelope open, the numbers didn't surprise me, but the feeling did. There was no triumph. There was no bitterness. There was only space. Space to breathe, to choose, to rebuild something in the quiet image of my own voice. That evening I wrote in my notebook again. This time the list looked different. What I kept, what I released, what I learned, what I am no longer afraid of, what I will create next. I didn't write his name this time, because for the first time in a very long while, the story no longer centered around what he thought of me. It was finally about what I thought of myself, and I liked the way it was going. The day of the closing came on a Tuesday morning, bright and windless. The kind of winter day Florida sometimes gifts you all soft light and quiet promise. I dressed in navy slacks and a pressed blouse. Simple, steady colors. Nothing flashy. Nothing to prove. Stephen met me in the conference room at the title office. The air smelled faintly of fresh paper and coffee. Documents were laid out in a neat stack, clipped and labeled. I ran my hand over the top page once before picking up the pen. Signing didn't take long. Name, date, initial, repeat. Halfway through, I paused, not because I had doubts, but because I wanted to remember the moment I officially let go of the thing they tried to claim from me. Not the house, the narrative. They had told themselves I would never do it, that I would remain the same woman who kept forgiving, who stayed quiet, to keep peace, who accepted being forgotten as the cost of being kind. But now they had no more room to rewrite what I had built. Once the papers were signed and notarized, Stephen slid an envelope toward me. Inside was a check with more digits than I expected, thanks to a competitive market and a last-minute bidding war. I looked at the number, nodded once, and placed the envelope in my bag without a word. He smiled gently. "You did this the right way," he said. On the way out, I passed Travis and Lydia in the hallway. They weren't there for a meeting. They weren't supposed to be there at all. But there they stood, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, caught between pride and something unspoken. Lydia looked away first. Travis held my gaze for just a moment longer. There was no apology. There was no anger either. Only a strange, hollow silence, the kind that lingers after a door has been shut too many times. I gave them a polite nod and walked past without slowing down. Later that day, I returned to the marina. I hadn't been there since the start of the legal process. The boats still bobbed in their slips. The breeze carried salt and memory. I walked to the far end of the dock where the water stretched wide and uninterrupted. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast, but instead of fear, I felt calm. In my pocket, I had the folded copy of the closing statement. I took it out, looked at it once more, and let the wind carry the edges as I folded it back up. That evening, I hosted dinner for 2 women from my book club. We sat around my small table laughing over overcooked chicken and under-seasoned salad. At some point, one of them asked how my week had been. I said I finished something that needed finishing. Nothing more. No bitterness. No saga. Because that was the truth of it. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about closing the door on a room I no longer belonged in, and locking it behind me not to shut anyone out, but to protect what was still mine. A few days later, a letter came in the mail. Not from an attorney this time. From Travis. The envelope was thin. Inside, a single page. A short note written in his usual rushed hand. It didn't say much. He acknowledged the sale. Said he was looking for a smaller place. Mentioned Lydia had picked up extra shifts. Then at the very end, he wrote 6 words that landed harder than he probably knew. I didn't think you'd go through. I stared at that line for a long time. Not because it hurt, because it revealed everything. They had counted on my silence, on my softness, on my love being stronger than my sense of self. But this time, love wasn't silence. Love was drawing a line. Love was saying enough. I folded the letter, placed it in the back of a drawer, and turned off the light. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a quiet applause. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Not waiting for anyone's understanding, not chasing anyone's approval, just standing on the other side of a line I drew with both hands, steady and unshaken. The weeks after the sale passed without noise. No unexpected calls, no more letters, no dramatic visits. It was as if something that had lived in tension for too long had finally exhaled and gone quiet. I had moved out of my old rhythm and into something new, something quieter, but firmer. Each day became a kind of ceremony. I would wake before the sun, brew a single cup of coffee, open the windows, and let the air remind me that this life, this space was mine again. Not just the apartment, not just the time, but the quiet dignity of choosing how I spent my days. One morning, I walked to a senior learning center I had read about in a community flyer. It was just a few blocks from my place. A low beige building near a quiet park. They offered short workshops and classes for adults over 60, from digital skills to memoir writing. I stepped inside and was greeted by a woman named Sandra, who wore reading glasses around her neck and spoke with warmth in her voice. She handed me a brochure. I scanned the list, local history photography, with your phone storytelling for radio. That last one made me pause. It was a small class, she explained, taught by a woman who used to work for a regional NPR affiliate. I signed up. It had been years since I'd sat in any sort of classroom. The first day, I felt like I was stepping into a room too large for me. But the instructor, Maria, was patient, and the others, mostly women with silver hair and soft laughs, welcomed me without question. We shared stories, small ones at first, then bolder. One woman told of hiding in a closet during a tornado in '73. Another spoke about marrying her high school sweetheart and losing him 2 years later. We listened. We nodded. No judgment, no fixing, just the act of being heard. When it was my turn, I didn't tell them everything. I told them about the marina, about the boxes of childhood drawings, about the silence that sometimes grew so thick you forgot what your own voice sounded like. I didn't need to say Travis's name. The room understood anyway. After class, Maria approached me. She said I had a cadence to my voice, the kind that made people lean in. She asked if I'd ever considered sharing parts of my story publicly. I shook my head, then thought about it for a second longer. Maybe not now, but maybe soon. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and paper, not to journal, not to make a list, but to write the first few lines of something new. Not a memoir, not a reckoning, just a piece of truth told in my own rhythm. It began with a woman standing alone on a pier, whined, pulling at her coat, and something inside her finally still. That was how I felt now, still. Not in a passive way, but in the way an old tree grows still. Roots deep, limbs open to sky, knowing storms will come but no longer fearing the wind. In the afternoons, I walked to the lake nearby, sat on a bench and watched the geese drift across the water. Sometimes I brought a book. Other times I just watched the light change. There was peace in that, in no longer having to explain myself, in no longer waiting for a version of family that would never return. I saw neighbours more often now. Mr. Yellis from down the hall gave me his extra newspaper. The woman in apartment 5B started waving from her balcony each morning. These were small things, but they added up. Life didn't have to be big to be full. One Saturday I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a simple postcard. On it, a photograph of a small lake surrounded by cypress trees. No message. Just a signature. Travis. I looked at it for a while, trying to decipher what it meant. Regret. Nostalgia. Or maybe just a gesture. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't respond at all. I placed it in the drawer with his last letter. Not out of anger, but because the silence between us had grown into something I no longer needed to disturb. I had nothing cruel to say. I simply had nothing more to give in that direction. And that in itself was a kind of freedom. As the months passed, I felt something soft and strong settle into my bones. A sense that I had reclaimed not just a house or a title, but the full dignity of my own presence. The right to take up space, the right to say no, the right to change my mind, the right to stop explaining why I chose peace over proximity. I no longer wished things had turned out differently. I only wished I had done this sooner. But even that wish faded. Because the truth is, I did it when I was ready, not out of spite, but out of clarity. And now every quiet morning was proof I had chosen well. Spring came slowly in soft waves. The chill left the air one breeze at a time, and the trees along the sidewalk outside my building began to unfurl pale green leaves. I spent more time outdoors on the balcony in the park, sometimes just sitting with the windows open, letting the world move around me while I stayed still. One Friday morning, while sipping coffee and flipping through the local newsletter, I saw a familiar name buried in the community announcements. Travis Rowe had taken a new position as assistant manager at a mid-sized logistics company in Clearwater. It was a step down from what he once had, but a step forward nonetheless. I paused, let the words settle, then turned the page. I didn't feel much. No bitterness, no pride, just awareness. There had been a time when every piece of his life felt like a reflection of mine. If he was thriving, I felt successful. If he was struggling, I felt responsible. That tether had snapped quietly sometime in the months since the house closed, and now he was simply a man rebuilding a life I no longer needed to monitor. A week later, I ran into someone who used to live near my old house, Joanne, who worked part-time at the co-op and always wore a red scarf, regardless of season. She stopped me on the street outside the market, her expression warm but slightly cautious. She asked how I was. I said I was doing well. Then she said she had seen Travis and Lydia recently. They were living in a duplex across town, she said, and from what she could tell, they were keeping things quiet. Joanne's tone was polite, but the silence between her sentences was thick with unspoken curiosity. I smiled and changed the subject, complimenting her scarf. She caught the message and didn't press. That night, I thought about how far things had shifted. There had been a time when being excluded from their lives would have broken me, when hearing about Travis secondhand would have pierced something in me that never quite healed, but not anymore. Distance had become a form of protection, a gift I gave myself. I still kept the few photos in my bedroom drawer, not to dwell, not to ache, but because they were part of the story, and I wasn't trying to erase the past. I was only making room for the future to grow in a cleaner space. The class at the senior center continued. Maria invited me to contribute a piece to the community radio hour, a small story, 5 minutes max. I wrote about the first time I felt real wind at sea on a boat with my father when I was 9. The way it filled the sail and tilted the boat just enough to thrill me. When the piece aired, I sat alone on the couch and listened with the lights off. There was something quiet and powerful about hearing your own voice carry truth into a world that had once tried to ignore it. In April, I received another postcard. This one showed the desert. Red rock cliffs, a sky bruised with dusk. On the back, just the words, "Hope you're doing well. Travis again." It wasn't much, but it also wasn't nothing. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because my life was no longer defined by whether he understood me. It was defined by whether I understood myself. And in that season of small blooms and quiet growth, I knew I had changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but fully. And now, no matter where he stood, or what he thought, I had stepped beyond the version of me who needed to be seen in order to exist. I existed anyway. I flourished anyway. Summer arrived quietly that year, not with fanfare, but with the slow shift of longer days and warm evenings that wrapped themselves around you like soft fabric. By then, I had found a rhythm that didn't require permission or validation. I woke when the light touched the curtains. I took long walks without needing a destination. I started cooking again, small meals for one plated with care, as if I were finally learning to nourish myself without the need to serve others. There were moments when I thought of Travis, but they no longer carried weight. They arrived like passing clouds, acknowledged, then gone. I kept writing, not to be published, not to be known, just to hear my thoughts spoken in my own voice. Words had always been how I made sense of the world. Now they were how I made peace with it. One evening I sat on the back steps of my apartment building listening to the laughter of neighbors drift through the dusk. There was a gathering upstairs. Someone had brought out a small radio, and old soul music played like a soft heartbeat through the walls. I let my head rest back against the brick and looked up. The sky was still light, but stars were beginning to flicker through. That was how I felt. Steady, still, and beginning to glow again after too long in the dark. I hadn't heard from Travis in weeks. No more postcards, no letters, no news from the neighbors. But that was all right, because the silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was space. And I had filled that space with something far more sacred than reconciliation. I had filled it with myself. It struck me then how often women are told their worth is in what they hold together. Families, traditions, holidays, homes. But no one tells you that there is power in letting go. That walking away with your name intact and your peace restored is a kind of triumph few will ever understand. I had chosen myself, not out of selfishness, but out of survival. And now I lived in a place built not from obligation, but from quiet, deliberate decisions. I had created a life where I could finally hear my own footsteps, where the echoes didn't belong to someone else's disappointment. One afternoon, I opened a new notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote 5 words. I owe myself this chapter. And I meant it. Not as revenge, not as a declaration, but as truth. I had arrived in this life not by accident, but by choosing to stop shrinking, to stop apologizing, to stop waiting at the threshold of someone else's comfort. That was the real ending. Not the check, not the closing, not even the silence. The real ending was becoming the kind of woman who no longer asked to be loved the right way, but who loved herself enough to walk away when she wasn't. And in that ending there was something beautiful. A beginning. If you've ever felt like you gave too much and were left with too little, I hope this story reminded you of the quiet strength you still hold. Sometimes choosing peace means choosing distance, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply walk away with our dignity intact. If this story touched you, I'd love to know. Share your thoughts or your own story below. Let's keep this space a place where women's voices, especially the quiet ones, can be heard.